ისიც ხმა მინდა მოკლედაც არ მინდა რადგან ყველა ვიღაცის ან რაღაცის გახდა მამიდა მე სხვა მინდა დრო უკვე დიდი ხნის წინ გავიდა ისიც არ დამეთვი ამზე მე რამდენე ჩავიდა და წავიდა Yo ვასტრიალე flows ეროვნულ სამს გავადრობ და ბასტავადე blows პროდუქტს გაჩვენებ ისეც გაწახებინებ oh no სტადი მოუხევი ეს ამბავი J Cole's კალაკიას მენინებ ჩემს freestyles ბინებს იმპირებს უსწორებ შავი ზღვის ნაპირებს ნადირებს და ვამტროკბილებს რას გასმენინებს მაშინ ამას უსმინე თუ ვერ ამუღამებ წინებს ამ სირებს მეტი რა უნდათ ინახავს ქალაქი პური და კარაკი კი არა გჭირდება მეტი მარაგი ეს ბანაკი არ გეკონოს ისტორიას მას დიდი და შენ ხამაში ჩამოსული და გჭირდება გიდი არ ვხიდი მე ვარ თქვენ შორის გადებული ხიდი ხო და მეტი პატივისცემა და იქონიერიდი აქ შეიძლება ვერ ნახოთ ესლი ჩემი ფიდი და თუ დაიკარგე სადმე იპოვე ჩემი სიდი ხო და მოუფრთხილდი და ნაგავს ნუყლი ძირს სწორემ ეს ასფალტი შეეხება შენ დაღებულ პირს და კბილს და ცხვირს ვერ მიაღწევ მტვრის ნაპირს ბოლო შეიგრძნობ შენს თბილისურ სტილს რა ვარია
Dear Helena, thank you so much for coming on to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. We're so happy to have you here. We met you last year at Historical Materialism, and it was like love at first sight. So I'm so pleased that you could join us. You've written a wonderful book, which I'm going to hopefully finish this month. And we wanted to do an interview with you and to give you. Because I think that your life is so fascinating that everybody should be able to hear it. You have the pleasure of hearing about it. And it so very much goes along with also reimagining Soviet Georgia and things that we do and how we think about people visiting the Soviet Union, about people's revolutionary journeys as well, because it's also about becoming, activists, revolutionary, and so on. And so I would like to first ask you who you are, tell us who you are in your own words, and then we'll ask more questions.
Okay. I'm an activist, an author, an academic. I'm an emeritus professor at Dublin City University. I was born in the USA in 1944. I've lived in Europe since 1972, mostly in Ireland, but also with intervals in places like Eastern Europe and South Africa.
Great. And let's dive into the fact that you were done before. This is a really fascinating story. Maybe you can tell us about your spiritual journey, your religious journey, and how you became a socialist.
Okay, well, I grew up in the US in the 1950s. I was a little Catholic cold warrior. I believed that I was told, and I believed that America was the greatest country in the history of the world. The Catholic Church, was the one true faith. This was the truth. And, I was privileged to be proud of this, and I was. It was an atmosphere extremely hostile to Marxism, to the left. Communists were not only the political enemy, but they were ontologically and cosmologically evil. Now, I was a very questioning child, even though I did believe this. At first, I found my way towards a more intellectual and liberal version of it, but I still kept thinking. And even though I entered the convent, that was a kind of assault on my thinking process. And I had to think my way right out of that. And I kept thinking, and I thought my way right out of the church altogether. When I left the convent in the mid-1960s, 1965, I became part of the 1960s New Left. And I was at a stage in my life, I was questioning absolutely everything at this stage, from the existence of God to the state of the nation. Everything had to be questioned and thought through all over again. But I was fortunate that by that time, I was doing it in a milieu where there were many others of my generation who were also questioning everything. And I really thrived on this atmosphere for a time, because in my earlier questioning, I was utterly isolated. In the convent, I was utterly isolated in the kind of questioning that I was doing, although that strengthened me that I could persist in an atmosphere so hostile to questioning. But, by the 1960s, the late 60s especially, the atmosphere was really electric. And it was very open to this kind of questioning. So I threw myself absolutely wholeheartedly into left activism, both in the universities and on the streets. So although I was left, and I saw that all of the struggles in which I was involved, the ones you would expect, against the Vietnam War, for civil rights, for women's liberation, I thought that they required a systemic analysis. They weren't separate from each other. They were very interconnected. But still, I didn't immediately become a Marxist. And I was still in the grip of this Cold War anti-communism, as a lot of my generation of the New Left still were. And some of them really never overcame that. So it was only when I came to Europe in the 1970s that I really moved from New Left to Old Left. And I became a Marxist my first year in Ireland in 1972, in the atmosphere of the Irish Republican movement. Then I joined the Communist Party of Ireland in 1975. And during my time before I joined the party, I came to a very different understanding of the October Revolution, the whole history of the USSR, the nature of the USSR and the other socialist countries. And so, eventually I went over to the other side of that iron curtain that had so dominated the imaginary world of my youth. And so I told this story in quite a lot of detail in my book, Navigating the Zeitgeist.
How did your background in the convent and in being a Catholic, how did that influence your political trajectory and your political development and path towards Marxism?
It had a very big influence. I mean, despite the fact that it was overtly against Marxism. But basically, I mean, Catholicism completely dominated the world of my youth, and and as it did for everybody, who was born in my time and place. But for me, even more than others, because I was so serious about it, I always had to live, even as a child, I had to live in terms of a worldview. I felt that everybody around me was so busy going someplace, they forgot to think where they were going. I always had to think about what I called the big picture. And so even after I stopped believing in God, I left the church, I still had this sense that I needed to have an overview, that I needed to live within a worldview. And I felt my whole worldview fall apart. I just felt the ground had come under me when I lost my belief in my existing worldview. It's as low as I ever went in my whole life, that I felt like I was in free fall, that I completely lost my bearings. But nevertheless, I had this strong desire to know, if it wasn't the way I thought it was, what way was it? And so I pushed myself to build an alternative worldview. And this is what I owe to Catholicism. It gives you this taste for this demand, for totality, this push to totality, this drive for comprehensiveness, and not only that, for commitment to the process. So it was an entire decade between losing my belief in Catholicism and becoming a Marxist. But before becoming a Marxist, I had a lot of the elements of Marxism already in place. I had a worldview that I defined as naturalistic and processive and contextualist. I didn't call it dialectical materialism, but it had, those elements. And I was also involved in the politics of the left. I had a critique of capitalism and a critique of imperialism. And I didn't get these directly from Marxism. but I had all of these elements in place. But when I became a Marxist, it was as if I was putting together this puzzle and I had a number of the pieces in place. And then the final pieces clicked into place and I could finally see the shape of it all. I could see everything kind of click together. Like there were elements that I didn't have clear, despite all the things that I told you I did have in place. I didn't really have political economy well sorted out. I was critical of capitalism, but you know, in a kind of moralistic, culturalist kind of way, and science. So political economy and science, I hadn't really got into place. And of course, I made it my big academic field, the connection between Marxism and science. And I've always paid a lot of, you know, attention to political economy, as any Marxist does, though I'm always learning from the people who are more expert in it than I am. But you have to have all of these elements together. And it's this drive to totality that is the continuity for me between my commitment to Catholicism and my commitment to Marxism, my drive to become a Marxist, really. So they're very connected in that way.
I always thought that like religious background was always very helpful, especially if you come from a more very strict sort of religious background, because you learn like discipline, morality, and so on. But then you also learn how to fight against that. And so that kind of necessary break of what you know, and then break from it is a very important step, I think, in the sort of process of becoming a socialist, a communist, a revolutionary, and so on. And I think
Definitely.
there's such a, and so it's first, when I first heard that you were a nun, it was like, oh, it makes total sense. Like your dedication, your level of discipline, and your lifelong, and your, you know, your book, you call it like lifelong, right? It's like your entire lifelong distance on the left until we fall. So it shows from even from the title, your sort of Catholic background, in that sense that you're fully committed and you know, willing to go the long distance, which I think is, you know, I don't want to get this like, oh, people nowadays, but like I think that there is a lot more a short term, not committal, very liberal sort of upbringing that I don't think always prepares, let's say, leftists to face so many downturns and so many sad moments. And you lived through the collapse of Soviet Union. You lived through so many things, right? Collapse of apartheid. I mean, it's incredible. Like your whole life you have. You've seen everything, and you've also witnessed all the insane downturns when you thought nothing will ever be better. You know, I'm assuming.
Yeah,
And
I
so
agree with
having
everything you just said. Yeah,
so having that
totally.
kind of, you know, that sort of Catholic background really kind of
Yeah,
grounds you, you know?
yeah. And the discipline. I mean, I just see around me just so much flakiness and indiscipline, and you know, it really steeled me for what I had yet to face that I didn't even know I would have to face.
It's really interesting because I'm always you know, always been a fan of discipline, even though often I lack it myself. But it's considered so authoritarian. Like discipline, when you say it, like it's like becomes like almost a bad word. Like, what is this, like top down? And why do you have to deny yourself things? And it's like champagne communism or yacht communism. So it's like it's really interesting how all the things that at some point were taken as, you know, common sense to be a revolutionary, you have to have these things. Now is looked upon as somehow like authoritarian, some kind of bad thing that you should not want to be or need to do to be able to sort of make it, you know, or continue the kind of work. So I find that really wonderful. And I hope people who listen to this, you know, learn from this, from you at least.
You know, we covered your Catholic background coming to Ireland from the United States and making this transition from the new left into the old left. And so, you know, a topic I'm personally very fascinated in is this history of the Irish Republican movement. And I'm really interested in your personal development and experience of becoming a Marxist at the in Ireland during the Troubles. Um,
Yeah.
and how you not only relate and understand the long trajectory of Irish republicanism in the 20th century, but in particular this period in the Troubles, which saw a lot of splits, different interpretations, different relationships, right? It's a moment in history that's not, necessarily as simple and romantic as some of the other
Yeah.
historical moments of Irish republicanism, but really caused a lot of tension. So I'm just curious, like, how did this experience in Ireland during the Irish Troubles, and this relationship with Irish republicanism in a longer term sense?
Yeah. Well, I got involved in the Irish Republican movement during my final New Left days in the US. So I came right into it. I arrived in Dublin Airport and went to 30 Gardner Place, which was the headquarters of the official Republican movement. Now, that was in 1972. So in 1969, there was a major split Sinn Féin was the legal part of it, IRA, the illegal part of it. So there was a major split in both Sinn Féin and the IRA. And basically, it was a right-left split. And there was this tendency all through the previous history of the Republican movement. There were some that were Catholic nationalists. It was just British out of Ireland, but with no real critique of imperialism beyond, Brits out of Ireland. Whereas there was from the beginning a more leftist tendency, more aligned to global national liberation movements leaning to the left, a whole critique of imperialism. And the 1960s, of course, a lot of those movements became Marxist or very close to Marxism. So this was exactly what was playing out, particularly in the Irish Republican movement in the 1960s. So I joined of course, there were a number of splits, both before and after that, but that was the major split. But between the officials on one official IRA in one hand and the provisional IRA in the other. So I joined the officials who were the left. And basically, the provisionals, who were the right wing, had this whole conspiracy theory about this movement to the left in the IRA. Basically, they saw it as a plot hatched by the CPSU and enacted through the CPGB and the CPI to turn the whole Republican movement to the left. But it wasn't like that. I knew these people very close up and very well. And basically, they had engaged in the kind of natural development towards Marxism, was part of the whole milieu of the 60s, and they were part of that. As other people in these national liberation movements were. They just found their own way to the left and to Marxism. And this was part of the Republican movement, even from the time of the Rising. As you know, James Connolly was a Marxist. But then, even though I was part of the left, after this major split, there was still a debate going on. Not so much between right and left, but between a kind of national liberation movementism, a kind of new leftist, position versus Marxism, and basically, a whole becoming part of the whole world communist movement. And I started off on the one side of that debate with a kind of more new leftist national liberation movement position, and I moved to Marxism and to a new position about the world communist movement within that debate. So it shows you how serious debates can be, where people actually enter into them and actually change their positions. So, people just, think people are just saying this and that, and there's no consequence. For me, there was a lot of consequence to that debate. And I ended up joining the CPI, but like I remained in in a good relationship with the Republican movement, particularly the left of it. So over the years, it was the left, the officials, that thrived politically in the 70s and in the 80s. Even electorally, they got a number of people elected to the National Parliament, Dáil Éireann, until 1989, when they kind of split for the reasons that a lot of, left, especially and communist parties ended up splitting over glasnost and perestroika and the end of the Soviet Union. And basically they still exist. They're called the Workers' Party now, but they're just tiny and not very influential. Whereas the right, in the 70s and the 80s, was engaged in armed struggle and not much into electoral politics and political movements, let alone Marxism. They engaged in the peace process, especially from 1998. And there was always a spectrum within this right, Sinn Féin, IRA, and they've kind of steadily moved towards the left. So the Sinn Féin you hear about now in international news is what used to be what comes from the right of that split. Only they've moved significantly to the left, and there's a whole spectrum within that, from people who are still Catholic nationalists to the dominant grouping who are kind of left social democrats to people who are Marxists. My son, for example, is a Marxist, and he's a candidate for Sinn Féin in the coming elections. So it's a whole spectrum. So what was the right has actually followed, accepted belatedly all of the arguments, most of the arguments of the left. So I've watched that over the years. The Sinn Féin are now the largest party in the polls and in political representation, although three other parties have made a coalition to keep them out of government. There's a possibility they'll form the next government, and I hope they have to do so with support from the left rather than from the right. I'll be voting to the left of them. But I think that that's the best chance Ireland has of a more progressive government. But I don't believe in them in the way that I once believed in the CPSU or the ANC or Syriza, all of whom betrayed the hopes that I and others placed in them. So yeah, that's again a very short version of a very long story.
No, I think that was a pretty good summary. So what happens afterwards? So you're in Ireland. You're become a Marxist. You're part of the Irish liberation struggle. Then what do you do? What happens
I
afterwards?
joined the Communist Party. And I became, not only a Marxist, I became a serious Marxist author. I began writing a book. I also got a PhD in Trinity, and I was writing a book on Marxism and science. And I was pretty fascinated by the debates in the history of Marxism about the relationship between philosophy, politics, and science. And a whole history of really lively, really interesting debates. And they were tied to all the other debates that were going on in the communist movement. So, I really immersed myself in Marxism as an intellectual tradition. And I was also a very active communist. And communists were expected to be active in everything, not only all your party meetings at national level, area level, local level, not only that, but you were supposed to be involved in every broad movement. You're supposed to be involved in, students' unions, anti-apartheid movement, Chile solidarity, your trade unions, everything. And so, I was, trying to, write a book and be involved in just multiple meetings. And I also had two small children during this period. And I look back and I don't really know how I did it, but I was 30 something. So, things are, you can do things when you're younger. That's hard to even imagine yourself doing when you're younger. I'm still pretty active now. But that's the kind of life I lived. It was kind of very, very demanding, very active, as well as, very intellectually demanding. So during this time, of course, I was thinking a lot about the Soviet Union. Of course, if you're a communist, you did. The Soviet Union was the horizon of hope. This was the kind of society that we wanted to create somehow. And you had to answer for it as well. And, Ireland was never as viciously anti-communist as the US in the Cold War, but it still was, wasn't exactly pro-communist either. So we were up against all of this, and basically, I wanted to see for myself, and the party, the party provided opportunities for people that were serious party members to do this. So I went to the Soviet Union for the first time in 1977. I was part of a CPI group, and it was a kind of crash course in Soviet studies. It was really brilliant. I mean, our days were struck. Oh, yes, I should say we were based at the International Lenin School in Moscow. Legally, if we were telling anybody where we're going, it's the Institute of Social Sciences. I think it was like, Sinn Féin IRA. There's a legal name and a kind of underground name. And at the International Lenin School, it was a semi-clandestine institution because there were a lot of people studying there from all over the world, and a lot of them were leading members of illegal parties. And they lived by pseudonyms and all of this. So there was it was an unmarked building, and there was a lot of heavy security surrounding it. So that's where we were based for this crash course in Soviet studies. There were a lot of people from other parties there, other communist parties that we came to know. But our day was structured so that we had 4 hours of lectures every morning. And then in the afternoons, so we had these planned excursions to museums and factories and farms, the whole Soviet thing that they did with foreigners. And then in the evenings, there was one group of us one group that kind of stayed around drinking with, people from other parties, and another group of us that kind of wandered the streets of Moscow at night. I was in the latter group. So the other ones argued that, well, they were learning a lot more about international struggles, by, staying there and drinking with comrades. But I always remember how much of it they remembered the next morning, you know. So especially when there's a new shipment of Czech beer that had come in, which was a great favorite of that group. So, but anyway, that, and there was also a week in Lithuania where we did this thing. We met with party groups in farms and factories and municipal governments and this kind of thing. So that was my first trip. My second trip was longer and much more productive. Not that the other one wasn't productive, but my second trip, I was there on my own. And you learn that you move around on your own, you learn things on your own, you get to know people differently when you're on your own than when you're in a party group. I was still based at the International Lenin School. I lived there, but I didn't have such a formal program. And basically, I was doing research for my book. So I was going out to libraries, to the Academy of Sciences, Moscow University, and all of that. And I created my own network. And I met people outside party and academic circles as well. And I learned a lot of things that other people at that institute didn't learn. So I was interested in the texture of everyday life, which of course, living in an institution, you didn't have, but I got to know people. I got, people invited me into their to their flats for dinner, and I used to meet different people for lunch and dinner. I learned about their lives, which is interesting. I learned about some things I didn't expect, and some things that other people at the institute didn't want to know about. Like there was a black market in flats and arranged marriages to get permits to live in Moscow, and a lot of these things which weren't that nice, but I'd rather learn the truth about how life was. And I also, my research was pretty fascinating because I was interested in the debates of the 1920s. And in the early days of the Soviet Union, you probably know this, there were debates about absolutely everything, everything. And most of the interesting debates were among Bolsheviks. There were debates about, the nature of industry and agriculture, the future of the family, free love, everything. And in my area, of course, these debates about science, philosophy, and politics were part of these debates. And so I threw myself into that research. I woke up every day. I had it set so that the radio would come on with the Soviet national anthem, which would wake me up at 6 o'clock in the morning. So I'd remember immediately where I was. And I just had such a sense of adventure and discovery. What was I going to learn that day? But I mean, my research also took me to dark places. There was all the exhilaration of all of these debates in the 1920s, and then there was a story of how all of these debates were bureaucratically closed down in the 1930s. And I learned a lot, not only there, but I knew the Western Sovietological literature about all this as well. About how the purges affected academic disciplines, academic institutions, and everyday life, and how all that played out. And that was directly part of my research, and I had to write my way through that. And I found that really tragic. I found myself in tears sometimes as I was, writing my final version of all of this, because it's a genuinely tragic story. And I also observed among, the Soviet intellectuals of my time, there was a kind of stale version of Marxism among a lot of them. And there's also, the CPSU. The CPSU was a party of power, and it attracted a lot of the people who joined parties of power that would not join communist parties when they were underground, and communists had to lead difficult, dangerous, risky lives. And so, as the Soviet Union got older and older, there was a higher proportion of these kind of people in it, who are, opportunists and time servers. And I wondered how many of them really were Marxists. I mean, some of them were. Some of them were really honest, serious Marxists. And some were they just recycled this, they said the same things over and over and over and over, and it was just so stale. And so, I had to navigate my way towards all of that. I wasn't a kind of, Pollyanna. And so I had trouble in the CPI because of my attitude to the USSR. To everybody outside of the party, and even to some people, in the party, I was very pro-Soviet. But to certain people in the party, because I raised any questions, and I said some of the things I just said, I was anti-Soviet. And I eventually just came under a lot of pressure about that. I had an article. I was at a conference in Prague in 1978, like all the leading communist Marxist intellectuals in Eastern Europe that were into philosophy of science were there. All the people I was reading, and I was very junior compared to them. I mean, I was a young intellectual who hardly published anything yet, and I was treated with such respect, and and such rich interactions with them. And also the presentation I gave was very well received because it was honest, and it was fresh, and it wasn't the stale version of Marxism. And a lot of what there was a mix of both, the stale types and the real honest thinking Marxist types at this. And so, my presentation was very well received. Then it came to, editing the thing for a book, and this Soviet editor just told me, that I was heretical, and I had to be heavily edited, and I fought back against it, and the general secretary of the party just had this attitude: if an Irish person and a Soviet person disagreed, then the Soviet person must be right. He didn't even want to know what the ins and outs of it were. And so I eventually left the party over a series of things like that. But I still considered myself, I still do consider myself a communist. Even though I wasn't a party member, I stayed on pretty good terms with the party, even though I just couldn't put up with being a member of the party anymore. I later belonged to another communist party when I was in South Africa. I belonged to the South African Communist Party in the 21st century even. So you know. I found, my relationship with the communist movement to be fraught, but, alive and important. And I still consider the October Revolution to be the most consequential event in the history of the world. I think it reconstructed a vast society in the interests of those who labor as opposed to those who parasite on their labor. That is huge. It expropriated the expropriators. It brought millions of people up from poverty and illiteracy to at least modest prosperity, purposeful work, access to knowledge and higher culture. Although it was fashionable and, the kind of intellectual circles I moved in the West to kind of scoff at socialist realism, I love the socialists we saw in the Soviet Union. I love these big murals of workers and peasants and scientists. I had certain Moscow metro stations where sometimes I would just get off and, be in the metro for a while before I would go on to, where I wanted to go. It was just tremendous to live in this society that honored labor, which is a really big thing, and so naturally, I think that, the end of the USSR and the other socialist countries in Eastern Europe, I think that has been a world historical tragedy. I was, in those years, I was just completely obsessed with thinking my way through it, because, I had this philosophy of history where the world was moving in however complicated, difficult a way from capitalism to socialism. And then here, before my eyes, on a massive scale, was socialism, a very imperfect form of socialism, but socialism, at least an experiment, a path to socialism, moving towards back to capitalism. And in a sudden, absolutely brutal kind of way, a far more brutal form of capitalism that anybody in the rest of the world was experiencing. And I just think, to see so much that had been built up by collective labor so quickly expropriated or dismantled, it was just so tragic to see it, and it's still being played out. You see it every day there. I see it on my television. The war in Ukraine is still part of all this fallout from the end of the Soviet Union that's playing out now. So, in those days when it was all falling apart, I spent a lot of time coming and going to Eastern Europe. And even when I was back in Ireland, my head was still there. I had to think it through. And this is a lot of what I wrote about in my most recent book, Until We Fall, because I saw a lot of this close up, especially in the GDR and Yugoslavia. And I've continued over the decades to go back to Eastern Europe and to trace the trajectory of all of this. I'm still thinking it through. I think it was, the kind of biggest, it was the biggest defeat I've ever experienced, even though I've had a lot of defeats. This was a huge world historical defeat for the left. And we haven't recovered from it.
Yeah, we definitely agree with that analysis. You said something really important. You said that it was attracting, the USSR was attracting the kinds of parties that would have never risked anything, that they were more into power, parties of power. That's a really important thing, that I haven't put it in that way before, so that was really helpful. But that makes sense because it happens all the time in the union world as well, right? So the people who have all these international relationships and so on and go on and go on are the ones who don't take risks. The sort of
Yeah.
scrap unions, we are the illegitimate one. We're not considered, worthy of these like bigger stakes, sort of going into these normalization and all this like, things that they give you, like, because we're not in power. So I don't know, like thinking about this and especially experiencing CPI as well, like I wonder always like how, because communists were very much marginalized in the Soviet Union. Because we also have friends, Georgian friends, who talk about how they were marginalized. And then these very sort of pro-market types or reactionaries were the thing we hated, that everybody now is like, oh, there was these problems within the Soviet Union. Those same people that are criticizing or the same people encouraging those things within the Soviet Union. So the real communists were actually the ones fighting against it.
Yeah.
Yet at the end of the day, the real communists are the one defending the Soviet Union, that they were being, the same people that now hate the Soviet Union were the ones actually destroying the Soviet Union in the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Or in the
Yeah.
so it's very it's an interesting twist, right? Because I also always think like, how did it get so bad? Like, how did no one, how did we get somebody like Gorbachev? Like, this is stuff that like constantly replays, right, in my head. Like, why was there no honest discussions, feedback? Why did it become so ceremonial? Like a lot of these parties and a lot of these visits and so on. Like, why were you marginalized? Instead of actually using some of the critiques and learning, it was like these things like really bothered me, of
You
how, what do
see,
you, but
my attitude to Gorbachev changed. I think Gorbachev changed. I don't think, I think Gorbachev was a communist, I mean, he was, it was the way to have a career and all of this, but, I don't think he was completely dishonest in the things that he was saying all of his career, and even in his first years as general secretary of the Communist Party. I think he was a Marxist. I think he was trying to forge an alternative path to socialism. And a lot of things in the Soviet Union did have to change. They did. And he was articulating a lot that needed to be articulated. I mean, people in my circles, he just seemed, so fresh. This was what the Soviet Union needed. This was what, the communist movement needed. This is what I thought at first. It's still what I think. Um, I think that he was pretty much the way we thought he was at that time. But I think that in moving in all of these international circles, I think that he got seduced by the powers that be in the rest of the world. I think this happened with Nelson Mandela when he went to Davos as well. There is no alternative. This is the way the world works. This is the only way to have economic efficiency. Um, and I think Gorbachev became a social democrat. Um, I don't think he ever went further to the right than that. But I think that it's interesting. One of the things that I discovered, I guess it was about a year ago, year or two ago, somebody called my attention to the diaries of Anatoly Chernayev. He was Gorbachev's, top foreign policy advisor. But he was based in the international department of the CPSU for many years. And he kept a diary from sometime in the 60s until the early 90s. And it's published. It's actually in the US, the National Security Archive, which I found a disturbing fact. But it traces Chernayev's evolution. He was a Marxist. He fought in the Second World War. He believed he thought really highly of Lenin. He got every new volume of Lenin's collected works. He thought Lenin was a great thinker. But he wrote honestly what he was thinking, what he saw going on all around him. A lot of this kind of ceremonial speech. He wrote some of the speeches for Brezhnev and and eventually Gorbachev, obviously. But he could see how stale it was, how sincere a lot of it was. He described party meetings, where all of these people that were half dead or falling asleep and were just, nodding, speaking all the ceremonial language and just nodding everything through. I mean, things had to change. And he saw that, Gorbachev saw it, but eventually they were just, this guy, actually then eventually became an admirer of Thatcher. He went with Gorbachev on all of these trips. They were completely seduced by global power and by a sense of defeat. The problems were so overwhelming, they stopped believing that it could be done, that it could be a socialist path. Chernayev, actually changed his mind on that even before Gorbachev. Gorbachev was still saying and meaning, until near the end, that he still wanted to find a socialist path, whereas Chernayev, towards the end of the 80s, had stopped believing that that was possible. This is a really, there are hundreds of thousands of words. I read it. He called my attention to, because he mentioned me in his diaries. He was representing the CPSU at the CPI Party Congress in 1979. I had a kind of explosive intervention at that, and he wrote about that. He's very sympathetic to me as opposed to the party leaders, actually. So I found that kind of interesting. But once I discovered these diaries, I wanted to read the whole thing, not just the reference to me. I just found the whole thing fascinating, going right back to the beginning and tracing his own evolution through all of this. So I think a lot of these people in the CPSU, some other ones there's a whole gossipy side to reading these diaries, because some of these were people that I had interacted with when I was in the Soviet Union. Some of the Soviet, the party intelligentsia were people that I knew. And I loved the whole gossipy side of it, and the things about their lives that I didn't see that he saw, and all of that. But like, it's just it didn't surprise me. It kind of added a lot of texture and detail to the picture I had already formed. I've always been particularly interested in, the last days of the Soviet Union and then the early days of the New World Order, and in terms of, the party intelligentsia. And basically they went every which way. And some of them were never Marxists. Some of them was complete opportunists. There was one actually I traced down to somewhere in Virginia. I made a Skype call or something to him. He was a professor at the International Lenin School when he was an expert in Arab affairs. So he's very in demand by the CIA, obviously, because he knew Arabic and he knew all the leaders of, the left in the Middle East and Northern Africa. He told me he never believed in it. Never. And others that I met, and I asked them what they thought. Oh, this way and that way, and they went every which way. But again, a lot of it was just you join a party in power. This is the way you make a career. I mean, even the intelligentsia, some of them were just blatantly dishonest, and some really were Marxists. Maybe in the way that some people are Catholics, they accept it and they never really think through what the alternatives are. But they accept it the way most people accept, like, the dominant worldview in their country. Because they never bother themselves to think of an alternative. At least some of the people in the Soviet Union and the party were honest Marxists that would have chosen it, would have been, on the underground. Some of them were people who were like passively Marxists, because that was what was presented to them. They never bothered themselves to think through an alternative. And then others were completely insincere. But there were some that were Marxists, you know, actively, passively, and just lost their faith in Marxism when it was all falling apart. And I saw examples of all of them in Eastern Europe. But like quite a few people I knew in Eastern Europe, because it's not only about the Soviet Union. I knew, the GDR and Yugoslavia particularly well, their intelligentsia, and they were honest Marxists, and the ones that are still alive still are. You know, so I found it really fascinating to trace all of that. I mean, to me, it's still an ongoing story. And you in your project, you raise this good question of memory politics and memory wars. These are ongoing, and I think your project is great because you're just engaging it head on, which I really think needs to be done, because it's so important. First of all, there are many people around, younger people that are in schools and universities, out working, that barely know all this happened. They really don't even know the basics of it. And so, there's keeping this on the agenda as a huge thing that happened in the history of the world. But then there's the version of it, because insofar as the story is being told at all, it's still being subjected to the most grotesque slander. And so it needs people like us seeing it in perspective, articulating all that was achieved, while still taking account of the problems, all of the externally inflicted and all the self-inflicted disasters of the communist movement. I think we have to be honest all about it. I think the best defense of the Soviet Union is an honest one, and not the kind of thing that the party leaders that I came in conflict with thought was the best way to do it. They did think it was the best way to do it. But like taking everything into consideration, the worst things. A lot of these anti-communists, I don't think there's anything now they can tell me that I don't know. I mightn't know the exact detail of what they're going to tell me, but I know pretty much the worst that they could tell me. I do, because I made it my business to know and to face it. Taking all of that into consideration, I think there is far more to defend than to denounce. That's the bottom line on all of this. And so even now, I feel that I need to constantly go on the defensive about this in responding to both the deceits and the delusions in the public discourse about the Soviet Union. I mean, there's been a revival of it with the war in Ukraine. I mean, there's this whole way that Ukraine presents its previous history as Soviet Ukraine just being a previous Russian occupation of Ukraine. And that is not what Soviet Ukraine was. And we know that. But it's very hard, for us to make. I mean, nobody's going to let me on on the airwaves to say that. I used to be on, the airwaves here quite a lot. They've lost my number, or they just don't want to know anymore. But and these are the people that are part of this consensus. These are the ones that want really strict platform governance. They rail against social media and how vulgar it is, because people like us at least have voices there that we don't have in the mainstream media. But I think we have to take every opportunity on social media, on mainstream media, if they ever give us a call, and in universities, at conferences, and insofar as anybody reads books anymore. This is what I've made a point of this in my last two books. Also, my first book that I was writing way back then is to tell an honest story about the Soviet Union and this vast world historical experiment in socialism. And I feel I have a special duty to do this, because I've had the opportunity. Nobody born now, or people, not even people born in the last decades, even can go to, the GDR or Yugoslavia or the Soviet Union.
I totally agree with you that, it's very important to have an honest assessment of the Soviet Union and state socialism. And that's one of the things that guides our project. That's one of the things that guides how I research the Soviet past and how we do things on the podcast. It's like, people don't have a very honest and nuanced, understanding of the history. The anti-communists, for obvious reasons, but also for us coming from the left. The 20th century hyper ideological debates often obscured the reality of the Soviet Union, both sometimes for, in these ways you talked about it, the kind of stagnant, institutionalized communist parties, as well as the kind of anti-Soviet, anti-communist left that emerged as well, right? Because of the Sino-Soviet split, because of the new left. And you see the ways that like a lot of the reality of Soviet life and the kind of like historically situated reality of Soviet development never got taken seriously. And so then after this, world historical defeat of state socialism, like my generation, for example, I just was raised in a situation where being in the Bay Area, Northern California, where it's like the question of the USSR almost like didn't come up. And then when you kind of align with various segments of the left at that point, it's almost like there was assumed positions, but never any kind of nuanced historical engagement, And at the same time, obviously in the popular memory and culture in the US, there's like a baseline anti-communism. So I totally agree with you, and that's how I think we really have to approach the Soviet past, to overcome the kind of limitations ideologically on both sides. And one of the things I also wanted to address really quickly too, just about Gorbachev, I think this is like a very fascinating topic. I actually agree with you that I do think that Gorbachev was some kind of earnest socialist, but I believe that he was very naive. And on our podcast, we interviewed Vladislav Zubak, who's a professor at the London School of Economics, who wrote this book, Collapse, about the end of the USSR. And I think for all of my disagreements with him, because he's kind of an anti-communist, pro-West, these kinds of things, he's very good at like articulating the naivete of Gorbachev and how his naive approach to trying to fix the problems of the Soviet Union that should have been addressed during Brezhnev, basically, because that's the important point, is that Gorbachev inherited problems that the Brezhnev era like couldn't deal with, that these are problems that like were debated, but for various reasons could not be structurally dealt with. And so Gorbachev is trying to sort of like inject new life into the US, into like the kind of into the Soviet system to address the problems. But his naivete leaves him unable to do two things. One, he's unable to actually get to the structural realities of Soviet life because there's this distance between his approach to the problems and the problems themselves. And then he ends up, instead of being able to address them structurally, he goes on the level of like surface level politics, right? It's like the rebirth of Lenin. So in a weird way, he's kind of like, we're going to go back to Lenin in order to like reinvigorate the kind of spirit of communism into the Soviet Union without addressing the structural realities. And part of that, to go to what Sopo was asking this question earlier, is like, why was there this kind of problem amongst the Soviet intelligentsia and the Soviet leadership to being unable to address some of the real problems in the Soviet system? How did it become this polity which was unable to kind of deal with the structural problems? And I think it's funny because, like, in a way, despite Gorbachev representing this kind of like exciting new reinjection of a communist spirit, like you were saying, excited you and other people at the time, it was like a naive approach to the reality of Soviet problems. And it seems like this distance between, concrete life in the USSR and then the ability to deal with those problems, exacerbated the issue. And I think, and the last thing I'll say is that in some ways, I think we often, especially on the left, look at the end of state socialism, the end of the USSR, as the culmination of its problems and it resulting in a failure, as opposed to thinking about it more as like the conscious dismemberment of an experiment. And the reason I think it's important to not actually view the end of the USSR so much as a failure, but as like a kind of political intervention to dismember it, is because we often aren't able to see its successes, right? And to see what it was able to actually accomplish, kind of like what you referenced. And in a way, I look at this like naivete of Gorbachev, or for example, the emergence at the end of the USSR of like nationalist movements, as basically being outgrowths of the success of the Soviet Union to develop basically a civilizational hegemony of socialism for a period of time. Like it was
Yes.
a very successful developmentalist industrialization and project of national consolidation. And so the
Yeah.
fact like the
And actually,
Soviet
this was at one stage 1/3 of the world. If you see a map
yeah,
of
exactly.
countries that were considered themselves socialists, it was 1/3 of the world,
Exactly.
and now it's four.
Exactly. And so that's what I'm saying. It's like, for example, last thing I'll say is just, it's like when you think about how what anti-communists and nationalists will say today is they'll say, you see how, these nations were bubbling under the surface, just waiting to get out of the Soviet Union because they'd been repressed by Soviet imperialism, totally misses the point. Because
It's
what
not
actually
true anyway.
well, it's not
It's
true
not
anyway.
true.
No, it's not true. But what I'm saying is that what that narrative obscures is the reality of the opposite, which is that it was actually Sovietization facilitated national consolidation for many, many peoples that had never experienced it before.
Yes.
It was so
Yes.
successful as a nation builder, right? So
Yes.
successful at developing a civilization, so successful at developing a kind of, again, a civilization that some of the problems, A, couldn't be addressed, or B, it was too good at building nations for its own good. And I
Yeah.
think that's one of the
Yeah.
approaches that
That's
I like
true.
to take, and that Sopo and I kind of take on the podcast, to kind of approach
Yeah.
it from this thing of like, what were its successes and how did its successes undermine its ability to continue?
Yeah. Yeah. That's all of that is true. Although just a qualification I'd make, I may agree with everything you said, but like it's not the total end of state socialism in that, there still are. And I tell you one way that this is all still playing itself out big time. There is no one who studies the whole history of the Soviet Union from the beginning to the end, and particularly the whole perestroika, the whole last period. There's no one who studies that as intensively as the Communist Party of China. They really, really, really study, analyze this, and learn everything they can from it. And a lot of the things that we've seen play out in relation to the Soviet Union are playing out now in relation to China. This whole new Cold War, and I think that we have the same tasks in respect to China. I'm spending an awful lot of my time now learning everything that I can about China. And I intend to go there sometime in this year and learn everything I can close up. I mean, I'll never learn as much. I have a different kind of time horizon now than I had when I was younger, but I'm still pretty fit for being as old as I am, and have a lot of drive to discover and to communicate what I discover. And I really want to come onto the defensive in this new Cold War that's playing itself out in relation to China. And I also think that China is some kind of horizon of hope for those of us on the left. Um, Not exactly in the way the Soviet Union once was, but in a way that isn't completely different either. And I'm spending a lot of my time, working my way, thinking my way through that at the moment. And not only like reading political science books. And actually, one of the things that I think is interesting is that, at the time, the whole perestroika period in the USSR, that China had already embarked on this reform and opening up. And it went very, very far. And I think that under Xi Jinping, there's a kind of rowing back on this. There's a lot more regulation of capitalist enterprises. There's a kind of attempt at a reinvigoration of Marxism. Um, and I really want to understand better how all of that is playing out. But a constant thread in all of this, in working their way through where to go. I mean, because they're charting a whole new path. They're actually experimenting in a whole new relationship between socialism and capitalism. Both globally and within the country.
So kind of to end on that note, like you said, like Gorbachev was seduced, like Nelson Mandela was seduced. There's this like moment of yeah, yeah. So how would we have not been seduced? So like, why was China not seduced? It seems like, right? Because well, I would have argued until you said also Tsipras is like they also started producing consumer goods, so it seemed like a lot of the seduction was being had by the sort of consumer goods drive, towards the Soviet Union, making them feel like they didn't have anything, and then give up everything they actually had for, all these cheap products. And there's like this scene in Zubok's book about the collapse is like, I think it's like Yeltsin goes into like a Texas store, like dollar store or something, and just is overwhelmed by all these cheap trinkets, And it's like this is what led to him being like, no, capitalism is great. It's like it seems insanely silly. Like it's ludicrous to me to be seduced like this easily over, supermarkets, right? And so what do you think? What would you have thought? Like, how do you reduce or count for many socialist countries, socialist leaders being very quickly seduced by this idea of normalization, idea of being part of this elite club? Like, what do you think about that? I guess like that would be since you have acquired so much knowledge and seen this come and go so often, what would be some of your sort of thoughts on this?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about it and a lot of questions, of course, because I mean, basically, the big question for all of us is how can we get from where we are now, even though the capitalism in which we live is deeply, deeply decadent, deeply decadent. Even where there's just a lot of goods in the supermarket, as there is in the US, and even here in Ireland, there are a lot of goods, but especially in the US, it is deeply, deeply decadent. It's it's on the verge of a civil war, and the two sides aren't even sides that people like you and I can see as anything worth siding with. Any sanity isn't even on one side or the other of this brewing civil war. So and it isn't just because oh Trump, oh Biden. What system throws up Trump versus Biden? What does that say? It's a system that is, and the nation is deeply decadent. How do we get from this decadence to socialism? I don't know the answer to that, of course. But I know what I do know is this. We have to constantly engage in a systemic analysis of capitalism, and particularly capitalism in its current stage of decadence. We have to articulate why it's decadent and how we can't continue on this path for every kind of reason, including ecological reasons, by the way. And we have to articulate the idea of socialism, not only, as it obviously sounds great from each according to their ability to each according to their need. We have to argue that, and we have to kind of defend the existing experiments in it. But my worry about it my really deepest worries are, first of all, how, the people that we put out there and allowed to lead our movements are seduced by the system. And a lot of people in the Communist Party of China, a lot of Chinese people are seduced by capitalism. And also, which worries me even more, is that I think that capitalism, even in its decadence, is still so powerful, not only to dominate the whole geopolitical economic system, but to colonize minds. The whole thing about decolonization, a lot of what's going on now is a puff of smoke, especially when Ukrainians, it's comes into the Ukrainian idea of liberation and decommunization. To use the word decolonization for that is such a travesty. But the greatest force colonizing the world, including the psyche, is capitalism. And I just see this, just the general population. And here in Ireland is far from the worst place in the world. But the extreme individualism. I just worry that, the mentalities of whole populations are so infected by the decadence of capitalism that could we ever build socialism? These are the worry. These are the big worries that I have. But this doesn't let us off the hook. We still have to argue our case. We have clear minds. We have to say, this is the nature of the system. This is how it affects your everyday life right now.
მაგრამ მე ვიმკითხავს ყველას დედაც ვინც მათ ნარატივს მიკითხავს დააგვერდი ეხლა ვიტყვი მეთეს რითმას ჩემ გარეულ კატებს ვუხსებ შეშინაურ ფირთხას ნაკითხას არ ვატარებ რომ გამარჯიოს ხებში თუ ინტერნეტში ვერ მიპოვი მომიკითხე ძმებში შეიძლება ქალაქის პერში მაგდროს გამტროს ფლებში რა ვქნა მიწევს ხორევარ კინა ბეტონის ჯუნგლებში ბავშვობის წლებში პირიქით ვსურვობდი ქალაქს ეს ქალაქი მაძლევდა უამრავ რითმების მარაგში რომ კარაქს გისმევდნენ პურზე აყოლებდი ჩაის ყველა ეროვნებასთან თრიაკეთ მივეცემი ჰაის ვიყენებ ხაიფს ვუბრუნდები მარაგს მიმართავ ზემოთ მდგარ რიზმენაში ჯალაც ამ ქალაქს წვიმა კი არა უხდება ნათელი და სანთელი და უნდე თუ რამე გაგშენ სათქმელი ეს ქალაქი ამსირებს აკნინებს აკინებს ნაპირებს ადგილებს ამბინებს ადიდებს ამპირებს უთხარი ვასრულებ თანაპირებს ჩემთან ეკნება საქმე ვინც რამეს დააპირებს ეს ქალაქი ამსირებს აკნინებს აკინებს ნაპირებს ადგილებს ამბინებს ადიდებს ამპირებს უთხარი ვასრულებ თანაპირებს ჩემთან ეკნება საქმე ვინც რამეს აპირებს ეს ქალაქი ამსირებს აკნინებს აკინებს ნაპირებს ადგილებს ამბინებს ადიდებს ამპირებს უთხარი ვასრულებ თანაპირებს ჩემთან ეკნება საქმე ვინც რამეს დააპირებს ეს ქალაქი ამსირებს აკნინებს აკინებს ნაპირებს